Sure, warning, there may be some language. The prose is incredible. To me, really sort of said something about growing up in Australia. So that is the Once Upon a Time for you. Hi, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. My name is Alice. I am a translator and from French to English. I live in Paris, but I was actually born in Australia, and today I'd like to talk to you about some Australian books. Okay, so first up we have a classic that is My Brilliant Career by Miles Franklin. So My Brilliant Career is actually a really surprising book because it was written by Miles Franklin, who is, as you might not be able to tell from the name, who was a young woman. It was written in the late 1800s by an 18-year-old girl. And it is a sort of semi-autobiographical fiction. Apparently, after it came out, a lot of her neighbors were kind of pissed, and they kicked up a fuss, and she ended up not wanting to have the book republished subsequently until after her death. So there's that. I think the thing that is really surprising about it is that it sounds, in some ways, it's really modern. The voice, the tone, and in some ways, it's obviously very much of its time. I don't want to give too much away. I don't want to give you spoilers, but there are parts of it where I felt like it almost, and I was surprised by this, like it almost obeyed the kind of literary conventions of a romance novel, but it does not go in the way you would expect. So, yeah, Miles's main character is a very headstrong young woman. She's really that archetype, but there's nothing contrived about it. She's obviously very sincere, and the sincerity really comes across in the writing. But the writing, whilst very earnest, and in some places you really feel the youth of it. It is also just very good, very well done. Like so, it's a surprising feat. And for a young woman of that time to be published was pretty incredible. And she writes interestingly about the life of squatters, so colonial settlers at the time, uh, the hardships of living on the land, and the lack of choice that you have being a woman in that time. The way she shirks, or she wants to shirk the very hard labor, the domestic work, the farm work, the choices that she has, the choices that she makes, the choices that she doesn't have, the things that she cannot choose. It's all very interesting. Um, that said, of course, it's a particular time and a particular perspective. So Indigenous people are pretty much absent from the book, except in comparisons of, I'd rather be a black man than something, something, something. So there's that. Um, but I was really really taken away by the book, really charmed by the writing, and it's funny in some ways because it's such. If you're Australian, you've heard of My Brilliant Career. You know basically what it is. Maybe you've seen the film. I mean, usually, I think most people would have. Um, and you've heard of Miles Franklin because she gave a legacy to a literary award, which is awarded every year in Australia, very prestigious prize. And but the thing about it is that it both met my expectations in some ways and also really, really surprised me. I think it's easy to sort of project what people thought, 100+ years ago, and what it would be like, and kind of project your own modern opinions onto it. But it's really interesting to hear a fresh voice from that time. if you can call if you can call a book written so long ago fresh, but it jumps off the page. Anyway, that is my first Australian recommendation. It's really one of our foundational texts and written by a young woman. So I do think you should check it out. Next up, we have another book written by a young woman, but much more modern. This is one of my absolute favorite books. I read it this year, but it came out in 2019. This is The Yield by Tara June Winch. The Yield is, I believe she actually won the Miles Franklin Award for this book. Very well deserved. Here I'm holding up the French copy, La Récolte, translated by Jessica Shapiro. And this book is, how can I describe it? Every time I really love something, I'm like, what can I even say? Where do I start? I think one of the things that really stood out to me is that it's a book that has several voices. So you've got the basic story is structured around this young woman, August, who's living in Europe, and she gets a call. Her grandfather's died and she has to go back to her small rural town in Australia for the funeral and to see her family, and she hasn't been back for years and years and years. And it's this interesting pull, like her hometown has this weird pull to it, whilst her, we don't get much of an insight into her expat life, but I really kind of related to this idea of like going home and what does that mean and what do people expect of you when you do that. And there's a lot of history there as well, a history in terms of her own life and history with a capital H, which we will see later on. And at the same time, the grandfather, before he died, had been writing a kind of glossary of terms in his native language, which was lost because he was part of the stolen generation. So to give you some context, in case you don't know, there was a whole generation of Indigenous children who were taken away from their families by the colonial authorities. This is quite recent, really. So, the book is set now, basically. August, I think, is probably around my age. And so this is a very part of a very traumatic past, something that happened to a lot of Indigenous families. This is the thing, the book I'm just trying to give a really quick plot summary, but the book just touches on so many big themes. Everywhere you look, it's embedded in the story itself, is embedded in the history of the country, and it's done in this way it doesn't feel artificial at all. I think that's one of the things I really love about it, is that it works on a micro level. It works on the level of the characters, who are very real, very endearing, some of them, and very relatable. And at the same time, it also works on a macro level. It says something about the country. It says something about our history. It says something about our sociology. And it does that without ever with while packing a punch, but not ever feeling teachy. If you see what I mean. Okay, to get back to the three voices, so we've got August, which is her story is told in a sort of omniscient third person. Then you have extracts from the grandfather's writings, which are just these wonderful, like bits of his dictionary that he's accumulating of Wiradjuri words. Tara Jean Winch herself is a Wiradjuri woman, so an indigenous author, and also a historical document of a German missionary who created an Aboriginal mission on the property where her family lives today. So there's a lot going on, and these different voices and different times really come across very distinctly, and I think that's quite a feat. And I wanted to read to you, there's something about the grandfather character who I found particularly compelling, and his glossary. It's not just a glossary of terms. You get little insights into his life, into his thoughts, into the history of the country through these different words. And I wanted to just read a little extract to you so that you can have a better idea. I don't think I'm not as articulate as Tara Jean Winch, and so I want to do the book justice, and probably the best thing to do would be just to read a little bit to you. So this is relatively early on. Yarran tree, spearwood tree, or hickory acacia. Yarrani. The dictionary is not just words. There are little stories in those pages too. After years with the second great book, I figured out the best way to read it. First time, I went in like reading the Bible, front to back. AA words first. There you find Aaron and him in the book of Exodus, brother of Moses, founder of the Jewish priesthood. Aardvark, that animal with the tube nose that eats the ants of Africa. There are abbreviations too, like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, where people go to heal from the bottle. That punched me in the guts. My mummy, she said, "The Aboriginal is a pity, my son." She said everyone was always insulted by her no matter what she did. So she let herself do the most insulting thing she could think of, take the poison they brought with them and go to town. You could keep reading the dictionary that way, front to back, straight as a dart. Or you can get to aardvark, then skip to Africa, then skip to continent, then skip to nations, then skip to colonialism, then skip to empire, then skip back to apartheid in the A section. That happened in South Africa, another story. When I was on the letter W in the Oxford English Dictionary, wire would be in that section. It means no. Wire wasn't there though, but I thought I'd make it there. Wheat was there, but when I skipped ahead, not our word for wheat, not Eura. So I thought I'd make my own list of words. We don't have a Z word in our alphabet, I reckon. So I thought I'd start backward, a nod to the backward white fella world I grew up in. Start at Y, Yarrani. So that is the once upon a time for you. Say it, Yarrani. It is our word for spearwood tree, and from it I once made a spear in order to kill a man. So you see there's quite a lot of tension. It's a very compelling book as well. Basically, I can't recommend it enough. I think if you read The Yield, you understand something about Australia. The next book that I want to talk to you about is Here Come the Dogs by Omar Musa. So this one is, it's a bit of an interesting. It's an interesting book in the sense that it's a novel, but it's also partly written in poetry. So you've got basically alternating chapters, poetry and prose. Omar Musa, his background, actually, this was his first novel. He's written one or two others since, I think. His background is actually as a slam poetry performer. So that really comes across in the text. And it follows the story of we've got a few young male characters who are basically a little bit lost and they're growing up in Canberra, I think it is, in a kind of underprivileged area, and the they're all basically from migrant families or migrants, and it gives you a, a bit of a different look at the kind of, and a part of Australia that I guess from overseas a lot of people don't know that much about. But it really resonated with me, even though my experience is quite different from the characters themselves. There were certainly things that I recognized. It definitely feels like a very Australian book, and I thought it was really quite a feat, particularly for a debut novel. And I think the thing that I just love about it the most is the beginning. The power of the poetry in the beginning is absolutely hits you in the face. And so I'm just going to do the same thing that I just did with The Yield and let the author speak for themselves. I will give you a short warning. There may be some language, maybe some bad language, right off the bat, page one. So I don't know, I might have to beep it out for YouTube, but we'll see. Where are these? Too hot, bro. Too long without rain. 2 by 2 they troop in, the madness of summer in the brain. In the dying light, the crowd looks like hundreds of bubbling balloons waiting to be unfastened. Sweating tinnies and foreheads, sad and sorrow drowners, the lot of them. I stand up, 6'2" and shining, yawn, twist side to side on my hinges and survey the crowd. It's not like the boys to be late, especially on a day like today. Summer, the deepest season, throbbing with danger and promise, every scallywag, seed thief and skate park, wrapped up in hot white skin. And here come the dogs. So there you have it. It's I found that really atmospheric. Reading that, I just felt like there I was at the dog races, sweating, my white skin being all pink. People standing around with tinnies. They've got their like cigarettes rolled up into their sleeves, or they're wearing wife beaters. I had the whole image in my head. Anyway, it packs a punch. It's an interesting ride. I definitely think it's worth checking out. Also, if you happen to be a innovative, interesting, and like on the ball French publisher, you may want to check out a friend of mine is actually working on a French translation of Here Come the Dogs. So feel free to message me if you happen to be a French publisher watching this and you think, oh wow, I want to get on board with this extremely interesting book. Do that. The next book I wanted to talk to you about is a graphic novel. It's called Everything is Teeth, by Evie Wild, with illustrations by Joe Sumner. This book, I was just wandering around the library when I was back in Australia, as I am wont to do, wandering around the library, and just saw it on the shelves, picked it up, and just got completely immersed in it, and just spent, it was probably only an hour max just reading through it. Basically, it's about a young girl and her obsession with sharks and shark attacks, and it's just wonderfully disturbing, creepy, but also, I don't know, really, to me, really sort of said something about growing up in Australia. Again, if you read this book, you understand something about my country. In this case, the character kind of goes back and forth from, I think, England to Australia, and again, most of the book takes place in Australia, but there's something about that that back and forth. There's a scene where they've been in Europe and they come back to Australia, and there's just this one panel where she says there's there is a giant huntsman, which the huntsmen are these spiders. I don't know if you get them outside of Australia, but they're they're brown with like big long furry legs. They can get quite big. Um, they're not actually very dangerous, but they're quite impressive to look at. And she says, there was a giant huntsman in my room. Everything was as it should be. And I felt like, yeah, I basically had that same thing happen to me when I was back last. So I saw the huntsman in my bedroom, and I was like, yep, hi, I'm home. Yeah, so a short read, an interesting read, a sort of disturbing read. Um, Definitely check it out for the vibes and for the teeth. The next book I want to talk about is one that I haven't finished yet, and in fact only just started. It is the work of another Miles Franklin Award winner, but he didn't get it. Oh, excuse me. There's a crocodile. um, Give me my book back. Yes, so Patrick White, quite a famous Australian author, he's famous in Australia anyway. And his novel Voss won the Miles Franklin, but I haven't read that. I've only just started reading this, Riders in the Chariot, and I don't know why I initially picked up this book, read the first page, put it down, and it just languished on my shelf until last night. Last night I picked it up, and I was blown away. It turns out this guy that everyone says is a really great writer is a really great writer. The prose is incredible. I don't know what to tell you about it, because I don't know anything about it, because I prefer generally to just go in blind to stories. This is like, I don't give a lot of detail about the books that I talk to you about. I just say why they are absolutely awesome and worth checking out. So I think I'm just gonna cheat, and I'm just gonna read you some of what I found so delightful about it. There was this. God, I hope I have fixed my mic issues. I do apologize for some popping in my previous videos. Was really not okay. So yeah, I'm on page 17. Not much has happened, but I don't know if this is the most representative part of the book. I was hesitating, well, so far anyway, I was hesitating between, there's this passage a little bit earlier on where our main character, Miss Hare, she's walking, so she lives in this giant mansion built by her father out in rural Australia. She's a character, right? People are like, she's a bit eccentric, and she lives there by herself. She's sort of an elderly woman, I think, and there's this point where he describes her just walking home, and she kind of kneels down in the bush outside of her house and just marvels at nature and the earth and kind of communes with it like the weirdo that she is. Like, her inner life is obviously extremely rich. And I immediately found this character completely compelling and relatable, which probably gives away a little bit too much about myself, particularly about this next passage that I'm going to read to you, but it just really tickled me. This Miss Hare has just hired a housekeeper, and she's waiting for this woman to arrive, and that's where we pick up the story here. "A housekeeper," she said, feeling her knuckles to test their infirmity and finding that they were indeed infirm. A housekeeper, though, was less formidable than a person, and this was what Miss Hare dreaded the most, an individual called Mrs. Jolly, whose hips would assert themselves in navy blue, whose breathing would be heard, whose letters would lie upon the furniture addressed in the handwriting of daughters and nieces, telling of lives lived unbelievably in other places. It was frightening, frightening. Miss Hare often cried in private, not from grief, but because she found it soothing, and she did now. It was frightening, though. Naturally, she found it impossible to like human beings, if only on account of their faces. Sorry, just stop to appreciate that. Cannot like human beings, if only on account of their faces. Anyway, yes, that probably might not have been the best passage to explain how beautiful the prose is, but you can kind of get a flavour of it and, and a taste for your eccentric characters, and the fact that while it's not a comedy, there is some humour to it, which I particularly enjoy. He really paints a picture of these, colonial settlers, and there's a lot in it already about this tension between the kind of aspirations, like the aristocratic European aspirations of some of these people, and there they are in the middle of the bush, kind of being uncomfortable and a little bit cringy about the fact that they're Australian and not part of the British aristocracy, which is interesting and tells you, again, a lot about Australia. The last book that I want to talk about I actually haven't read at all, but I went to the launch of the French translation recently, and I thought it sounded really interesting, so I wanted to talk about it. It is The Drover's Wife by Leah Purcell. Leah Purcell, who my fellow Australians may know more for her acting career, but she's also a playwright, a director, and an author, and she has come out with her own novelized version. Basically, The Drover's Wife is based on a short story by Henry Lawson, who is another of our sort of the Australian literary canon people writing around the 1800s. And he, yes, I believe, turn of the century. And he wrote a short story about the drover's wife. So a drover, if you don't know, is someone who drives cattle. So they move the cattle from one place to another. Obviously, Australia is very big. Drovers might be off for months at a time, and so this woman is left to fend for herself in a harsh environment with a number of children. And it's just a short story of like one night where a snake comes into the house, and she has to stay up with a stick waiting for the snake to pop its head out so that she can kill it and keep her children safe. So it's the short story I also recommend. It's a beautiful spare prose. I guess the thing about the novel, as far as I have heard, is that it takes the short story, then expands on it, and it is, instead of being, a piece of the, colonial literary canon, it is an entire novel, written by an Indigenous woman. So it's not just, a white man's perspective on what the struggles of a white woman might be in a certain time, but it's so much more than that. Now, the novel obviously has the time and this perspective to explore so many other facets of Australian life, but through the prism of this kind of foundational story in terms of our culture. So I think, yeah, I think it sounds really like it's worth checking out. I think it's called La Légende de Molly Robertson in French. I'll put all the details here, just in case you are a French viewer and you would prefer to read it in French. It was translated by my good friend Mireille Vignol. Anyway, that's all. Obviously, there are many other very interesting Australian stories that I could talk about, but that will have to be for another time. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.